Tiffany and I had the opportunity really late December, early January to go to the Holy Lands. It was truly a trip of a lifetime. It was amazing. And some of y'all followed us on social media and kind of lived that trip with us. And when we got back, we heard the same question over and over and over again. What was your favorite part? And that was probably the most difficult question to answer because there were so many things that were life-changing, that were so significant, that were just amazing events or places or experiences in the Holy Lands. But I guess the best way to answer that question, if I had 2 hours to do anything that we did again, it would be to go to stand on top of the Mount of Olives, to overlook kind of the Kidron Valley, and to walk. And that's what we did on the first day we were in Jerusalem. We stood there, we had a little devotional time, and then we walked the very walk that Jesus rode the donkey on that Palm Sunday in his triumphal entry, as people celebrated and shouted and clothed the road with their cloaks and their branches and honored him as king. It was just an amazing event to be able to walk down there. And that's what we kind of celebrate on this Palm Sunday as we remember Jesus riding that donkey. And, being kind of the group leader, I asked Bruce, one of our guys, I said, go down to the city and get a donkey. And if they ask what it's for, just tell them my bus captain needs this. And then we didn't see him for a couple days, so hopefully, I'm teasing. But it was an amazing event, and when you get to go over there and have the opportunity to see so many things, there are so many amazing, life-changing things that you can see. And really, as we approach our characters in chronological order, we get to these people like Gideon, who we're covering today, and really cover Gideon in 30 minutes. It's almost as a daunting task as trying to figure out what your best part was on your Holy Land tour, because there's so much in Gideon's life that is significant, that applies to us, that explains to us and challenges us how we fight our battles. Now, we're going to look at Gideon, and I'm going to try to just do a flyover, so fasten your seatbelts. We're going to cover a lot of what Gideon went through. In the book of Judges, which is the beginning of April in your chronological Bibles, there are 12 judges, but the most space in Judges is given to Gideon. And really a few chapters to his story gives us what made this man so special. And really he went from weakness to strength. And in a couple weeks, we're going to study Samson, who went from strength to weakness. And in between there, we get to celebrate the resurrection and the power of Jesus Christ, which brings us life. So next week, we'll talk about that at the end and give you all the information you need to know about what's happening this week and really how to celebrate best the resurrection next weekend. So as we look at Gideon, if you have any type of Bible knowledge, if you Old Testament, you got to know a little bit about Gideon, you're going to know three things about Gideon. First of all, that he's the one that laid the fleece down. God, I'm not sure, we're going to cover that in a second, but Gideon's fleece. You may remember or recall, if you have some knowledge, Gideon's mighty 300 men. In fact, Hollywood, it was such an incredible story, and we're going to look at that. And then the third thing you're going to know about Gideon is that he is a sneaky guy, that he has really snuck into every hotel in the world, and in the nightstand next to the bed, he's placed a Bible, okay? That's some recon work right there. I don't know, have you ever seen a Gideon? Have you ever seen one put in one? No, but they're there, aren't they? You kind of almost comfort when you check in a hotel to open up that nightstand and see the Gideon Bible, and that's an organization that really models themselves after our man Gideon this morning. But really this morning, I want you to know that God still uses the unlikely. If you weathered the storm last week, and you were one of the few and the proud and the mighty and the brave that came last week, you saw that God uses the unlikely, and our character was Rahab. And she was unlikely because of her past and because of her profession. She was a harlot, and God used her. And God used her not only to save the army or to give them some advance warning, but he used her in the genealogy of Jesus. Amazing story. God uses the unlikely even regardless of our past. But this morning, I want you to know that God uses the unlikely even when we're fearful and when we doubt. And when you look at Gideon, and so I believe it's April 1st in your Bibles, you can open up, we're in Judges chapter 6. Gideon, we find Gideon, we have to know that the people had rebelled against God. And when we think about judges, let me clear this up. Don't think about like big black robes, gavel, and you're banging it on the courtroom and you're a man of knowledge. These were warriors. These were like generals who also had a political kind of influence in the culture. So military leaders with a little bit of politics mixed in. That is the judges of the Bible. So when we pick up Gideon in chapter 6 of Judges, they have been oppressed for 7 years. For 7 years, the Israelites have grown their crops, they've raised their animals. And for 7 years, the Midianites come in when the crops are ready, they come in and just absolutely wipe it out and steal everything that you've grown. Think about if you've been working for months and months and months. You've planted, you've plowed, you've weeded, you've done everything you can to plant a great crop. And when it's time for harvest, you pick the harvest, and then the big bully down the street comes and just takes it from you and leaves. That's what the Israelites had done for 7 years because they were disobedient and turned their backs on God. They forgot God's care and his love for them. They forgot God's plan. So the Midianites had come, and so we pick up our main man Gideon here in 6:11. It says, now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, not Oprah, Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while the son of Gideon threshed wheat in a winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, the Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. And this is ironic and a little bit humorous because he is threshing wheat in a winepress. And if you're not familiar with the process there, when you thresh wheat, you basically take it and you throw it in the air and you let the wind take the chaff away and the good stuff falls to the ground. But he's not on the top of the hill where you'd normally thresh wheat. He's in a wine press. He's down in a pit, almost like a cave, where yes, you would, if you were I Love Lucy fan, it's a TV show, black and white, y'all, some of y'all, where they get in and they stomp on the grapes. That's really the wine press. And Midian is down in this cave, in this pit, threshing wheat, which has to be just a frustrating task because there's no wind to take away the chaff. Why is he there? Because he's scared. Because he's scared of the Midianites, because he knows that if they see him finishing up the harvest, they're going to come and steal it, and he's going to be starving like the rest of the Israelites. And the angel of the Lord appears to him and says, oh, you mighty man of valor. It's almost if you take the most scared person that's shivering in their shoes and so fearful, and you walk up to him and go, you're the bravest person on earth. That's what the angel of the Lord says to him, but he's fearful. In fact, his fear continues when he gives him his first task, and we'll get to that task in a second, but he does it at night. He says, I need you to go wipe out this temple or this altar of Baal and this Asherah pole. And Gideon was so scared that he waited till nighttime, and he did it. And then later on, God's going to say, I'm giving you these people. You can go, or if you're still scared, you can go and do one more scouting trip and listen to what the people are saying. And you know what Gideon does? He doesn't take God at his word there. He goes down and he scouts it out until he hears affirmation from the enemy. He's fearful, he's fearful, he's fearful. That's great news this morning, church, because if you're fearful, if you're scared, if it worries you, God uses the unlikely. And Midian basically faces his fear and turns his fear into faith, and God does extraordinary things when we can transform our fear into faith. And Gideon was also known as a doubter. I love this because the first thing he says in 6:17, he says, then he said to him, if I have found favor in your sight, this is Gideon talking to the angel of the Lord, which is really a pre-incarnate Christ. It's almost like the second in the Trinity makes himself known before he comes to the manger to speak to Gideon. He does it several times in the Old Testament. He says, if I found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who talk with me. That was his first sign. He says, I doubt so much if you would do me a favor and create, I'm just going to do a little test for you. And if Lord, if you can pass the test, then I'm your man. Okay? I want you to know that we're about to lay some fleece down to a more familiar test that Gideon does. God does not answer our tests. It is not our job to say, God, I'm going to put you to the test, and if you are real, if you are true, if you are speaking, if you are truly more powerful than the enemies or the foes that I face, then you'll answer this test. But what this does when he answers basically 4 tests, it shows you how loving, how kind, and how patient our God is. And in those times when you say, God, I just need a sign or I need this, we don't put our faith in the fleece, but God is so kind, so patient, so loving that sometimes he gives us affirmation that we're on the right path, that we're being obedient, that it is him who is speaking and challenging and moving our direction. And so what this first test is he goes and gets this sacrifice, and he brings this sacrifice to the angel of the Lord, who I said is a pre-incarnate Christ, and he offers it to him, and the angel of the Lord basically touches it, and all up in smoke, gone, totally burn up in a second, in a flash. And Gideon says, okay, maybe this is real. Maybe it is you, Lord, who is speaking to me, challenging me, directing my path. Now, what do I do? Now, the next test is the fleece. And we see that in 6:36. He says, so Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, look, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, the ground is dry, then I'll know that it is me. The first one is, God, I want to know it's you speaking. When he lays down the fleece, he's saying, I want you to convince me that it's supposed to be me that you're going to do a mighty work in and through. And so he does it twice. He says, I'm going to lay this fleece down. And in the morning, if the fleece is wet and the ground is dry, I know it is you using me to have victory in Israel. This is an amazing thing. So he wakes up in the morning, he picks the fleece up. The ground around it is dry as can be. And he wrings the fleece blanket out and fills up a pitcher of water. And then Gideon, who's doubtful, it's just encouraging that God uses those who doubt him and question him. Sign number 3 comes next in 39. Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me, but let me speak just once more. Let me test, I pray, just once more with the fleece. Now let the dry only be the fleece, and the ground around it be dewed or wet. And then he goes to bed, he wakes up, and sure enough, he says, the next morning he comes in, and the ground around the fleece is soaked. But he makes his way through the soaked ground, and he picks up the fleece, and it's dry as can be. He says, God, it is you who calls me to do a mighty deed. And then he challenges him 4 more times by going down before the battle and listening to basically the enemy. And God's telling him, I'm giving you this battle, I'm giving you the victory. And it's not until Gideon goes down into the battle and listens to 2 of the enemy soldiers say, you know what, I had this dream and it was this wheat, and you know what? And then that was the 4th and final test. And the thing about Gideon's story, the thing that kind of puts everything in the puzzle pieces together and fits it, is he doesn't go for fear and that's resolved, and then doubt and that's resolved, and then he goes to obedience. In fact, the fear and the doubt are mingled into his obedience, which is a great encouragement for you and for me, because we don't have to totally eliminate all the fear and the doubt in our minds in order to be obedient and have victory in God's plan. In fact, every step of the way, Gideon's got a little bit of doubt, maybe just a little bit of fear. And God shows up and uses him in miraculous ways. And it doesn't mean that we have to eliminate, you know what? God's going to use you in your workplace, in your school, in your neighborhood, in a mighty way. Well, God, you can't use me because I've got this little ounce of doubt. I've got this little piece of fear that's just plaguing my heart. That's okay. God can use you if you do the same thing that Gideon did. The next thing is he was obedient. I love the fact that he was obedient. And he really finds his obedience in a few things. First of all, was spring cleaning. Okay? This is what the angel of the Lord told him to do first and foremost in 6:25. It says, now it came to pass the same night that the Lord said to him, take your father's young bull, the second bull, the 7-year-old, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the wooden image that is beside it. It was an Asherah pole. And build an altar to the Lord on top of this rock in the proper arrangement. Take the second bull and offer it. And so look in 27. It says, so Gideon took 10 men among his servants, and he did as the Lord had said to him. But he feared his father's household and the men of the city too. So in coming by day, he went by night. That's that little bit of fear, that little bit of doubt still mixed in there. But this is the first step for us being used by God in a tremendous way. We have to eliminate the old. And this was a pagan culture, and part of the reason that they were under oppression of the Midianites is because they had basically turned their back on God and started worshiping the gods of the Midianites. And so Gideon's own dad had this altar built to Baal, the most common god for the Midianites. And right next to it, this tall pole, it was an Asherah pole, probably like the Festivus pole, but wood, not metal. No Seinfeld fans out there. But he has this, and so he said, the first thing, Gideon, for me to use you in a miraculous way, the first thing you need to do is make a difference in your home. That may have been the most difficult task, and as we're going to see in a minute, he had a difficult task at hand. But you need to go to your dad's house, and your dad was worshiping pagan idols, and you need to tear it down. And what happens is he takes 10 of his men, and they go and they wipe out this altar of Baal. They cut down the Asherah pole, and they build God a proper altar, getting back to the roots of who the father of Abraham has called them to be. Getting back to where they know that they're supposed to do, and that's worship and sacrifice and love and follow God and not the gods of Baal or Asherah. And he does this and says the next morning, basically, the whole town comes out and they're ready to kill whoever did this. And Gideon made a difference in his home because his dad steps up for him. It was his dad's altar. It was his dad's pole. His dad said, you know what? If Baal's a god, let him defend himself. And there was a little bit of change in Gideon's dad. Why? Because Gideon took the things of the old, the pagan things, the things of the culture, the things that everybody in town wanted to worship, and he eliminated them. Our first step of obedience oftentimes is to clean house. Get rid of the things of the old that you don't need, that are not needed for you to follow and worship God and God alone. So this morning, we may need to do some spring cleaning in our lives. We need to go, what am I holding on to from the old life? What do I think culturally has more significance than me building an altar and worshiping the one true living God? So spring cleaning was his first step of obedience. The second one is he's gonna gather an army, okay? This is what God tells him to go ahead and gather an army. So he gets a trumpet. It says in 6:34, it says, but the Spirit of the Lord came to Gideon. Then he blew the trumpet, and the Abiezrites gathered behind him. So what he did is he stood out in the middle on the top of a hill, and he blew the trumpet, which was a battle cry. Come and join a voluntary army. Because for 7 years, we've been bullied by our neighbors who continue to steal our crops and steal our animals and plunder everything that we grow and everything that we build. And you know what happens? 32,000 men come ready for battle. We think, man, what an amazing, that was out of 4 tribes that answered the call, the horn of Gideon. And 32,000, that is an incredible army. With the problem was, they were battling the Midianites that were 135,000. They had over 100,000 more soldiers than our 32,000 army. It says, not only do you have to gather your army, God says you've got a manpower problem. And Gideon's sitting there probably as fearful as ever, saying, you're exactly right, God. They've got 135,000. We have 32,000. We've got a serious manpower problem. That's not what God meant, though. God says basically, why don't you trim your army? And that was the third. It says, and the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into your hand. lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, my own hand has saved me. God looked at these odds, 135,000 versus 32,000. He says, nope, too many. Gideon, trim your army. In fact, just tell everybody that is scared to go home. So I can imagine that he calls everybody in like they're about to get a good pep talk. Inspire us, Gideon. And Gideon says, hey, if you're scared, go home. It's almost like, the Alamo line in the sand and everyone just ran out of the Alamo. And that's really what happened. 22,000 left. 22,000 people packed their bags, left some of their stuff, and started marching toward home because they were scared of the battle. God looks down, there's 10,000 remaining. 10,000 versus 135,000. God says, nah, still have a manpower problem. And Gideon's going, well, you got that right. He said, still too many. Okay? Now, he said, I want you to take these remaining 10,000, take them down to the creek, and I want you to watch how they drink. If people who bend down and stick their face in, I want you to put them on this side. People who lap like a dog, I want you to put them on this side. People have tried for years to find the significance that the people that put their face in the water, that they weren't good. So it was just God's way of sifting the right from the left. He was trying to trim his numbers so it would be a miraculous victory. It'd be like, I take 10,000 people to Whataburger. Everybody that gets a lid and a straw, you go home. Everybody that just drinks straight from the cup, you're part of my army. Something as insignificant as that. It didn't mean anything except God wanted to get down to a number that would allow him to receive the credit. And that's exactly what happens. It goes from 32,000 to 10,000 to 300 men actually picked the water up and lapped it with their tongues like a dog. And he says 300. Now that is a number that I will get credit for. See, God wants to call people who are able to face their fears and their doubts and to stand and allow God to work in them and through them. We've been asking people to do some things out of their comfort zone lately. And a man who was doing that last week said, how do you stop from passing out? Because I'm so fearful that my knees are shaking. And he said, but the reason I'm doing this is because it's not me. I know it will be the Lord and to his credit because this is so outside my comfort zone. When God trims the number from 32,000 to 10,000 to 300 men, it's time for him to get the credit and the glory and the recognition for the victory. He basically trims the army, and then he does one more thing of obedience. In 7:17, I love this. He says, and he said to them, look at me and do likewise. Watch, and when I come to the edge of the camp, you shall do as I do. One of the greatest steps of obedience is leadership. You say, Stephen, I'm not a leader. I don't have a position in a class or in the church, or I don't stand on stage and lead in that way. You are leading someone. And when you face your fears and when you defeat your doubts and you're obediently following God, it's amazing how many people will follow you. But you have to have the confidence and the obedience to say, as Gideon did, do as I do. When you go into battle, be strong enough, be confident enough, be the leader enough where you can say to the men and women around you, do as I do. Parents, just as Gideon had to go to the household to make a difference first, it is our job as parents to lead biblically, lead in obedience, lead by example. To not look at our kids and say, do as I say, but do exactly what Gideon did and say, do as I do. And when they follow you, if they read as much scripture as you do, if they prayed as often as you do, if church was a priority in their life just equally to the priority that is in your life, would they be growing and thriving and obeying God? That's leadership. And God called Gideon to forget his doubts and his fears and to be obedient in leadership. And the last thing, really, the culmination right here is he gives him not only victory, he gives him miraculous victory. He gives him miraculous victory. It can only be miraculous victory because you have 135,000 trained soldiers with weapons, with camels. First time that we see in recorded history that camels are used for warfare. The Midianites are in this valley. They're in their tents. They're ready to strike and come in and wipe out the Israelites. And Gideon gets his mighty 300. And he says, I'm going to take you 100, and you're going to go up on this hill, and I'm going to take you 100. I'm going to put you on this hill, and I'm going to take you 100, and you're going to go with me. And that's when he says, do as I do. And he looks around. He says, we don't have swords. We don't have spears. We don't have clubs. But we're going to use what we have. And what they had when they went into battle wasn't conventional warfare. They had three things. They had a torch. I don't have a torch because they don't let me play with fire on stage. They had clay jars. And then they had their shofar, their horn, their ram's horn. And Gideon says, I want you to do as I do. And when I get on the mountain, I'm going to blow my horn. 135,000 men down below. It was in the middle of the second watch. They had just gone from first watch to second watch. It was in the middle of the night. And 300 men surrounded them against 135,000. And Gideon stands up by leadership with 300. As 300 men blow their shofar, and Gideon says, that woke them up. That will make them frightful. And they held their torches in their left hands, their ram's horns in the right. And they proclaimed with the trumpet and in unity that God is victorious. And I love it. The men said basically, the sword of the Lord and the sword of Gideon. You know what they had? They had a ram's horn and a torch. No swords. But God promised him, I will be with you, and I will give you victory as if you were one man. And you know what happens? God shows up in a miraculous way. The men are so frightened of 300 horns blowing, pots crashing, lights up there, and they think it's 300 different armies. And the Midianites in their camp wake up and they're confused and they're frightened and they start killing themselves. And the ones that don't kill themselves flee. And Gideon sends word to those 22,000 and those 10,000 or 9,700 that were all going home. And they said, hey, if you see a Midianite run by, go take care of them. And God provides a miraculous victory. Why? Because he was obedient. Because he was faithful. Because he said, I don't care what the odds are, Lord. I don't care if it's 300 versus 135,000. I don't care that we don't have machine guns and bombs. I don't care. All we have is the sword of the Lord, which is his word. We have the trumpet that really symbolized the worship and the calling of God. We have the torch, which always symbolized the presence of God. And we got God's plan. And if we're faithful to do that, this is what happens. Judges 8:28. So Midian was subdued before the sons of Israel, and they did not lift up their heads anymore. And the land was undisturbed for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Gideon's faithfulness. He went from fear and doubt to obedience and victory. And the result was 40 years that Israel had peace. 7 years they were just ravished. 7 years the bully took their food and everything that they had. And Gideon's faithful obedience and his miraculous victory allowed him to have 40 years of peace and turning his people back to facing and following God their Father. What fears do you have? What fears do I have? What doubts do we experience living in a world where people want to come in and steal our joy and our knowledge and our peace and our understanding and our faithfulness to God? What do we need to get rid of so that we can proclaim the truth and the victory of Jesus Christ? The first thing it might be is just letting go of the past, letting go of the fear and the doubt, and embracing the truth that Jesus Christ brings the ultimate victory.